be honest with yourself for a second. How much of what you're doing at work right now is actually working? That question came up again and again at Insights EDU last year. You guys already know this isn't your typical higher ed conference. And I've got to be honest, I've been to a lot of higher ed events, and Insights EDU is just different. The conversations are direct, the sessions are outstanding, and the people in the room are there to fix real problems, not defend the status quo. That's why Insights EDU 2026 matters. It's 3 days in Fort Lauderdale, February 17 to 19, focusing on real strategy for higher ed. No fluff, no recycled playbooks, just what works now. You can keep wasting time with what feels safe, or you can get in the room where smarter decisions are being made. Register today at insightsedu.com.
You just made the list!
Ellucian Live 2026, April 19th through 22nd in beautiful Denver, Colorado, advancing infinite possibilities. And it's higher education without limits. Don't just keep up with change, lead it. Higher education leaders from around the world are coming together at Ellucian Live 2026. Across 4 unforgettable days, discover new ways to meet students where they are and make the most of your technology through inspiring sessions and hands-on demos. Together, we're leveraging AI to create deeper human connections, support every student's journey, and open doors to lifelong learning. See you in Denver. Register now at elive.ellucian.com. It's going to be
amazing.
Welcome back, everybody. It's your time to EdUp on the EdUp Experience podcast, where we make education your business. This is Dr. Joe Sallustio back with you on another episode here. As I have said in a couple of recent episodes, we're really, really proud and excited to tell our audience and loyal fans and listeners that we are now ranked in the top 1.5% of all worldwide podcasts. There's like almost 4 million podcasts, and we're in the top 1.5%. Considering we have a very specific audience of higher education professionals, we're pretty stoked and excited about that. I am not feeling my best today, so I brought in somebody that I know can carry a good episode if I fail. He is just doing great things out there, starting companies, moving. He's all over the place. I'm going to leave it to him to tell him what he's up to. Ladies and gentlemen, he's Samir Qureshi. He's the outgoing CEO and soon-to-be executive chairman at NAC. Samir, what's going on, man? How are you?
Hey, doing well, Joe. Glad to be here. Thank you.
Congratulations, by the way. It sounds like you brought in an amazing CEO at NAC, and you guys are doing big things.
We did. I like to say I fired myself.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Almost 11-year journey as a founder and CEO of a ed tech company in the higher ed space. Taught me a lot. And, I feel like there are people that have done this longer and bigger and better than I have. And excited to be supporting that individual now at NAC, Megan, who spent 17 years at Kaplan, supporting her as executive chairman of the board and watching the team continue to do amazing things under her leadership.
I mean, I guess if you could fire yourself.
Victory!
We'll take it. And interestingly enough, and not anybody knows this, but we did a podcast together and you're CEO, and then like 2 weeks later we did one and there was a change and I got your whole intro wrong and everything, but it happened within a very short period of time. So I'm sure not on your end, but on my end it seemed like it was fast. So really, really happy for you, and thanks for being here today. We have a great guest. I'm going to bring him in right now and make sure I get all of these intro pieces right because he's got a lot going on. Ladies and gentlemen, he's Chris Klaus. He is CEO of Fusion and co-founder of the Georgia Tech CreateX Startup Accelerator. Woo, Chris, what's going on? How are you?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
No, I'm glad you're here. You're sitting on a beach, or at least that's what your virtual background says. Probably not doing that, but I hope you are. We're excited to have you here. We love to talk about students, about startups and ideas and the entrepreneurial nature of the way we need to think these days. So the level set for us. Tell us a little bit about the Georgia Tech Startup Accelerator, CreateX, and how this all came to be.
Sure. I think really the beginning of all this was my own journey, where I was at Georgia Tech as a student, and I had been working on a cybersecurity tool that would find vulnerabilities on networks and tell you, how someone could break in. And I didn't know what to do with the tool. I thought it was really powerful, and this was, like 30 years ago when the internet was just starting to take off in the 90s. And with that, I got feedback to go release it for free, and I did that, and I actually had tons of feedback. And I had one person at Georgia Tech, or an advisor, who said, "Hey, have you thought about commercializing it?" And that was the one question that, I was like, "Oh, hadn't considered it, but now that I'm thinking about it, might as well give it a shot." And so maybe a month or two later, I came out with a commercial version, and actually got customers, and then that kind of got me to think about, like, maybe I should do this full time, because as I spent more time on my startup idea, Georgia Tech's not an easy school. So it was like, either I'm going to, do good at the startup or good at the academics. But if I try to do both, I could quickly see that I'd fail at both. So I actually ended up taking a break from Georgia Tech, pursuing the startup. Fortunately, I found a co-founder, Tom Noonan. I found that this is a problem that was scalable on a global basis. So we actually ended up growing out of my grandmother's spare guest bedroom into kind of a headquarters where we had offices all over Asia, Europe, the U.S. and Latin America, et cetera. And so with that, and we ended up taking it public and ultimately got acquired. But a couple of things that happened out of that is I gave some equity to Georgia Tech in my first startup, and that turned into the Klaus building, which I was very excited to be able to upgrade the students to an amazing building that teaches the latest in AI and machine learning and all the latest algorithms. And I would go down there and talk to students, kind of in some ways kind of trying to replicate what I was doing or what I had received, which was a question like, "Hey, what are you working on? Have you thought about commercializing it?" And most students were like, "No, I hadn't thought about it." And you realize that's a cultural issue that almost every university, probably 99% of all the universities, default to, you're there to get an education so you can get a job and get out. And not realizing there's another opportunity, which is, go get an education, but also you could create jobs instead of just getting a job. And that's where entrepreneurship, that's the path I took. And I think a lot of students didn't realize that's a viable path. And so instead of me trying to do it as a one-off, I was like, how do I scale this? So I ended up working with a dean at Georgia Tech and building CreateX, which was the idea of like, let's put together a program where having students, instead of interning for some large company like a Google or Amazon, why don't you intern for yourself? And so during the summers, we would have them start building their startup. And we saw that more than half continued working on their startup ideas. And out of that, we've scaled it up to, we've had close to 1,000 startups go through the program now. And last summer, I think it was over 150 startups. And Georgia Tech's now moving into not just summer, but any semester you can do a startup. And it's, you get credit for it. They're actually starting to offer an entrepreneurship minor degree. So that's pretty unique at a university where you can go build your startup, and you get funding for your startup, and you get all the mentors and resources. And it's also probably one of the best times to do a startup, because you're not married, you don't have kids yet, hopefully, especially if you're in college. That's hard enough. And you don't have a lot of expenses like a house and cars and stuff like that typically. So with that, it's a great time to do a startup because you can kind of really focus on it, because the one thing startups will take is a lot of time. And so being able to take your energy and time and put it into building a business, to me, I looked at it as like, really, is like the internet university 2.0, in terms of you're going to learn quickly you're not just reading about how to drive a car, but when you're driving a car, you'll learn faster. And so if you want to learn business, I'd say get in the driver's seat. You're going to wear every hat initially because you got to figure out, how to build the solution, how to go find customers. Those are your two big problems. And then if you can get those two things solved, then you're off to the races.
I love that.
Yeah, wow, so much there. And Chris, I love hearing this. My story is actually kind of interesting. I'm a Gator, and actually Georgia Tech's a big customer of NACS, and so we're huge fans of the institution. One of my favorite campuses to be on. And interestingly, so I was a student, first gen immigrant, came to the States as a kid, struggled academically, led me to start NAC, which is now the leading peer-to-peer tutoring platform for colleges and universities, where schools fund it, top students get paid to help others on campus, and then the institution benefits from better progress rates, retention, graduation, et cetera. And I was working at Gartner, a company you're probably familiar with if you've been in the tech space, and I quit to start NAC in 2015, and I actually moved back to the University of Florida. They had a student incubator called the Gator Hatchery. We were one of the first cohorts, and they didn't, and I don't believe they have a fund yet. And so we were sort of given some amazing resources to get the corporation incorporated and figure out how to, sort of trademark our logo and that sort of stuff. And, the missing elements were really like I was a non-traditional, non-business student. I was a sociology, criminology major, thought I want to go to law school. There I was coming out of Gartner and wanted to build an ed tech company. And interestingly, I was at this crossroads where I was 21 and so many people told me the same thing. Like, look, you got no mortgage, no kids, no student debt, thankfully. You have a dog and you got a lot of energy. So why not go build if you've got this idea? And so I ended up taking that risk. And even though I joked about firing myself, which, I was lucky to be on this side of it, it was the best decision I ever made. And I always tell young entrepreneurs that I speak with now that had I known how hard it would have been, I wouldn't have done it. But at the same time, the times have changed. You can build faster, cheaper now than ever before. You can vibe code an MVP. You can come out of college not needing to raise money from a VC. And we did take the VC path. We've raised over 20 million. We ended up raising from Arizona State University and a number of other venture funds, and learned a lot as a non-business student that didn't study business. I was school of the hard knocks and scraping knees and elbows along the way. But, I spend a lot of time talking to young founders or students that want to be founders and try to encourage them just as you are in your work. And I have a strong belief that there's been no better time to build. And I think you just sort of said that yourself. And I also believe that the most, not just professional transformation, but even personal transformation can come from building a business because it teaches you a lot about life and failure and everything in between. And, I'm curious, I get this question so much from young entrepreneurs. Like, I got this offer to join Deloitte or JP Morgan, but I really want to build. And, I'm not technical, or maybe I'm a little technical. How should I make this decision? Should I go corporate? Should I go to go out and build? And I have my own perspective on this as someone that has, a little bit of experience being in corporate and quitting. But how do you talk to founders and advise them accordingly as you think about these two sort of huge opportunities, one that's safe and that on the outside looking in is going to look really great on a resume and parents are going to feel good and you'll feel good to have a safe 401k and benefits, but maybe not feel as excited about it as jumping out into doing something of your own, which has its whole host of, things to learn and be, sort of on the front lines for. So I'm curious how you advise founders or young entrepreneurs.
Yeah, it's a good question. Usually, and are you thinking about it still while they're students or post graduate?
Yeah, I mean, look, my perspective on this is like always be building, always be trying stuff. I had a bunch of failed ideas with my now CTO in college. But, I'm talking more like the student who's maybe junior, rising senior, trying to figure out whether to accept that offer or not. How do you advise them to kind of go through that mental model or framework to think about what the right thing is there?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. A lot of times I think there's probably not a single like silver bullet where it's like, hey, this is one way, but ultimately, I do try to let people know, like, the opportunity is kind of once in a lifetime to go find that. You'll have this time to go do it. Number one, in that this idea, so many startup ideas uh, are time based, meaning, if you try to do Uber now, it's too late. There's already an Uber, right? And if you did it before the cell phone, that probably would not have worked either. So there was a point in time where certain ideas, especially if you're in the technology industry, makes sense. So some of it's a little bit of an urgency of, is your idea that you want to work on, is that something that's applicable today, that will it be true in 10 years from now? But to your point, you could always do a startup later on. I do think early on there is some misconceptions that I run into, where I have a lot of students that are like, oh, I want to go work at a Deloitte or an IBM so that they get the experience to go apply it to a startup. And it's actually it's probably one of the worst things students could do, because it's all the worst patterns that are good in a large company, but not in a startup. And in fact, I've hired people from IBM and other places. Not that they were bad people, but they didn't know how to move like you would in a startup, where you're wearing lots of hats. We brought in an executive that had to have an assistant read his email, and you're just like, what's taking you a week to do, anybody who's kind of fresh out of school is knocking it out instantly. So it's really an opportunity to learn if you want to do a startup. And I think the data so far doing CreateX is that more than half the students continue with their startup idea. Half of them probably figure out that they don't want to do startups. Hey, it's a lot of work. A lot of it might be, I don't have the right team. And it might not be the right timing. Some of them, there may be other things, like they want to go to grad school, or they want to, any number of reasons why it's not working out for them. But in general, I think, you just got to weigh, like, how passionate are you about the idea you want to work on? And is Deloitte going to deliver on that? And I think the reality, at least with probably a lot of the top universities, students that are coming out that are getting offers from a Deloitte or an IBM or any other company, those offers are going to still be out there. So go ahead and do a startup. And if it doesn't work out, I have full faith in these students going to be able to still. In fact, one of the other big data points, because I talked to, like, the head of research at Apple and other large companies, and a lot of them are like, we're looking for resumes of kids that went and did a startup, may not have had the unicorn hit, but they've learned how to talk to customers. They're willing to get on, take risk. And they're more well-rounded after that experience than somebody who's just going to help maintain the code on the back end. I mean, it's just,
Totally.
what do you want to do?
I always say, it's a badge of honor, even if you fail, because it was funny. My co-founder got an offer to join Boeing, and this was well before things had been rough for them. But, and we started talking, and he's like, the only thing cooler than joining Boeing is telling other people that I turned down the offer to go to Boeing. And I think that's such a true statement, because I'm sure Boeing would take him back any day now, because he comes back after, almost 10 years of building a product and pivoting it and going through all the crazy stuff, ups and downs we've gone through. And I've always told young entrepreneurs the same thing, is like, hey, there's something cooler than taking the job, which is turning it down. And for me at Gartner, one of the things that almost gave me the fuel to go is my SVP of sales was like, hey, I heard you're going to go build this thing. If it doesn't work out, you can come back here. We'd welcome you right back. And so I'm like, man, why not go leave now? What's the downside, really? And so I love to hear that. Let me ask you one thing, Chris, is sort of a hot take. We've all kind of read about the Teal Fellowship or Z Fellows and all these groups that pay you to drop out of college. When we were at UF, my co-founder was still a student. That's how we kind of hacked all the resources, because I was an alumni at the time. And he chopped up his course load to get as many free resources as possible to lengthen out his time at UF. And, one of the things that the sort of entrepreneurship director at the time kept hammering us on was like, Dennis, you got to go to class, you got to graduate, or we're not going to be able to, give you these resources. So it was sort of this love-hate relationship between like, I got to show up to class and still do something while I'm building. But, ultimately now, I'm talking to middle schoolers, high schoolers that are talking about, I don't know if I want to go to college. I think I can just build something right now. And maybe I just do like online school. And like it's kind of getting pushed down younger and younger, which is exciting when you think about the promise and the potential and the sort of like building a company more accessible and exciting for young people. But as an individual who's working at Georgia Tech, how much do you toe the line or have to sort of like play that game of making or of sort of upholding this belief that a college degree matters when you're trying to be an entrepreneur at the same time, or maybe you're deciding whether to go to college or to be a builder? Like, how do you think about that? How do you think about the value and, sort of the theoretical application of learning versus the tactical, let's go out there and actually build a company or be project based and doing internships, co-ops, externships, et cetera? I mean, do you find yourself between a rock and a hard place at times as someone working in Georgia Tech to say, hey, sometimes maybe it's okay for someone to take a gap year or totally drop out or not go to college at all?
Yeah. Well, I think a gap year is different than some of the other things because my son took a gap year and, with mental health and everything else nowadays, if you're feeling stressed, maybe it's worthwhile doing that. But I think the intent of the gap year is to come back and still finish your school. But I think you're bringing up a really good set of questions with why go to the universities, and to me, there's really a lot of people think it's the education piece that you're getting for your tuition. Now, Georgia Tech is one of the cheapest universities, so I'm kind of biased because it's, a lot of the complaints about universities, how expensive it's gotten. But the math on Georgia Tech's degree is like the number one ROI. If you get a degree there, you're going to make 3x whatever you spent. And so it's a good ROI, but also I would argue the piece that people don't always get is when you get into a Georgia Tech or a UF or any of these schools, it's not that you got an education. It's also the people you connected with. It's your friends that you make there that become your lifelong network that I think you can tap into. And I see this with the students at Georgia Tech where they're able to then call up alumni and say, hey, I'm a Georgia Tech student. I need help with X. And immediately the door's much more likely to open because they know you went to Georgia Tech. And that's probably true with if somebody calls you up from UF and says, hey, I'm a UF student, how do I, you're probably more likely to help them because you went to the same school, the campus, the culture, et cetera. So I think one of the biggest advantages you can get at a university is finding other really smart kids that can be your co-founder. And I can tell you that that's probably one of the biggest challenges to get off the ground is how do I get a co-founder? The data shows that if you have 2 or 3 co-founders, it's your chances are significantly better if you want to turn it into a $1 billion company. Versus if you want to have like a home style business, then it's okay to do it just yourself. But it turns out that the data shows that having co-founder, 2 co-founders, 3 co-founders is an advantage because everybody has strengths and weaknesses, and startups are hard, and pulling together it's an advantage. The data also shows like 40% of all co-founders are people who found their co-founder from the same university they went to. So there's some advantages that go beyond just an education. It's really the networking, finding co-founders, finding resources. I would say also the resources you can get at the universities. They're really ramping up.
Yeah.
On the maker spaces. You can build prototypes that you can't do anywhere else. And you can, and then you have faculty, you have business schools. To me, it's like
Tech
you're
licensing.
you're
Yeah.
you're basically getting a turbocharge, and you don't. I didn't get a degree, so I'm not going to say that you have to get a degree, but just getting into Georgia Tech immediately gave me that network. I had professors I could call.
Yeah.
I had other friends that I did rely on. I'd be like, hey, I need somebody to help me with a web page here and there, or there's enough people there at Georgia Tech. I
Yeah.
could find, and it's a strong network of people wanting to collaborate and help you and open doors. And I think that's unless you've gone to university, you don't realize there's a huge amount of value beyond just the education.
Totally. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I met my co-founders at Florida, for the most part. And like I said, I kind of had some failed concepts with my CTO, until we finally, hit on knack and felt like it was really the thing that was going to keep growing. And thankfully it is. It's interesting. Like Joe and I have talked about this. We've spoken about this with some of the other guests on the podcast. I have a strong belief, and it's part of what knack really believes too, is that like content's commoditized. The what's in a textbook and what's on a curriculum and a syllabi, you could Google that, find it. You could string together a bunch of YouTube videos and figure out, sort of how to educate yourself. But the power of community and knowing that if I apply and get into Georgia Tech, I'm going to be sitting with a bunch of Chris Klauses. That's really right, the value. And it's almost like the value of B school. You go to grad business school and get an MBA, they actually hype up more the networking opportunities than they do the actual curriculum. Um, so a big believer in that, and it very much rung true for me, right? Sociology and law and criminology didn't really apply in building an ed tech business per se, but having those co-founder relationships and working together and trying stuff together is really kind of what built that magic between us to ultimately go start the company. Chris, I want to pivot a little bit and have you share a little bit more about what you're building at Georgia Tech. At Florida, I certainly wish we had a fund. I certainly wish we had, a little bit more than what we had at the time. And perhaps they're getting there now or are there. But, what I've found is that, institutions are behemoths. We've sold to them. We're proud partners, Georgia Tech and others, as I've shared. And so sometimes if you're trying to build sort of an accelerator, an incubator within, I've seen this done really well at Berkeley. They've got Skydeck and they've got sort of a fund, house fund, which is Alex Fiance's fund that's kind of, vis-a-vis to the institution. Tell us a little bit more about the resources that you're putting into your programming and how sort of in the DNA of the institution it is versus next to it by design or not. Because I've heard the pros and the cons, and I think it's amazing to see that there's a real bucket of resources beyond sort of the in-kind stuff that you're hoping to put together or are putting together right now for students.
Let's go
to insightsedu.com. Remember that URL, because let's be honest, how much of what you're doing at work right now is actually working? It's time to inject fresh ideas and effective strategies. And Insights EDU is for these leaders that want to see results. The conversations are direct, the sessions are outstanding, and the people in the room are there to solve real problems, not protect the status quo. Insights EDU 2026 is February 17 to 19 in Fort Lauderdale. No fluff, no recycled playbooks, just what works now. Register today at insightsedu.com. Ellucian Live 2026 is taking place April 19th through 22nd, 2026 in Denver, Colorado. Advancing infinite possibilities. Turn innovation into action with AI-powered solutions, student-first strategies, and a global network of fellow leaders at Ellucian Live 2026, higher education's premier global technology conference. It's going to be
amazing.
Yeah, so I think we did this concept of learn and make, and we've also did like research. And so one of the things that changed in order to change the culture at Georgia Tech, we actually put entrepreneurial classes in your freshman year, and peppered that in to a lot of the curriculum across Georgia Tech, especially so most of it was on the engineering side. So this is just from a high level perspective. a lot of people, when I talk to universities, a lot of them go, "Oh, I have an accelerator," but it's usually on the business school side, and then you realize it's usually the challenge with the business school is they don't usually talk to the engineering school, and the people that we want to fund are people who can build the solution. You need to have a technical co-founder. As you mentioned, you needed a CTO to figure out what the heck to build. And I think part of Georgia Tech's success is when I was setting this up, I was like, I want this housed in the College of Engineering, tied in with computer science, tied in with all the other engineering disciplines. Guess what happens out of that? You get like 90% of the students are all engineers, versus if I put it on Georgia Tech has a business school. If I put it over there, it'd be a bunch of business students. Nothing wrong with business students, but their number one problem is they don't know how to build the idea they have. I'm like, okay, do I want to fund somebody who's got a good idea but doesn't know how to build it? And so you see those pitches and you're like, okay, great idea. Where's the product? And I need $1 million to go build this. Or I go over to the engineering side and the founders have already built it, because that's what engineers can do or computer science students can do. And next thing you know, it's like, all right, they've already built it. They've got a demo. They're actually getting customers. And I'm like, that's what I want to fund. And I think, so that's probably one of the big things is we put it into the educational side. We then started saying, look, let's have a launch so that if you've got time during the summer, go spend the summer building it. We also did something on the research side that's pretty unique. So up until CreateX, Georgia Tech was a well-established, well-regarded research university. But typically, if you're a student, you'd go find a professor that was researching some area, some domain, and then you'd further that research. What we ended up doing together was really inverting that model. And what I mean by that is it's the student that comes up with the idea. And in fact, there's a whole class on it called Ideas to Prototype, where the students come up with the ideas and the faculty help the student with their research. And the beauty of this, it becomes from an IP perspective, guess who owns that? It's the student. And so then you don't have to worry about licensing and all this overhead that you have to worry about most universities. So that's turning into a big thing. The other big area that we've kind of went full circle is called capstone. I don't know how many universities have capstone programs, but basically I'd go to the capstone and amazing ideas. I'm sure have you guys been to the capstones before? I'm sure so if you've gone to one, you're like, wow, that's a lot of great research, a lot of cool projects. That's a startup idea right there. And they're like, oh, I just did this to get my degree so I can, go off and get my job at Deloitte. And the reality, though, is what we ended up doing is we now have a CreateX capstone. And it's a small tweak, but it's on the front end. Would you like to work on a research project that could become a startup? And then, not that they have to do the startup, but just asking them on the front end, do you want this to potentially become a startup? A large number of them get really passionate as they work on their problem. This is no longer an idea that is to get a degree. It's like, this is actually turning into like, if you work on this for a semester, you're going to see that, hey, maybe there's a real company that could come out of this problem. And so we actually have a lot of our startups have either come out of capstone or have come out of research, ideas to prototype. So that's really shifted the culture more and more at Georgia Tech. A couple other things that were, I think, huge unlocks that are just starting to take effect. That would be great for other universities is Georgia Tech. I had students that had on the research topic, maybe they did do research the traditional way. And here's some really cool IP at Georgia Tech that did X. And then I'd go, okay, well, for us to fund you, you have to have a license because otherwise you're working on stolen IP, And so I don't want to risk that? Can you go get a license? And more times than not, they'd go to the IP licensing office, and it might be 2 years later before they could get a deal done. And the IP just dies on the shelf because it turned out that the incentive structure, and I got to believe this is true with most universities, is usually you're dealing with lawyers who are super risk adverse, who would rather not do the deal than do a bad deal. They don't want to be like, oh man, I just licensed something that's now $1 billion and we didn't negotiate the best deal we could have gotten. Well, the problem with IP is nobody knows what it's worth. It's worth nothing sitting on the shelf. And so we ended up, I was like, why don't we just have a license that's pre-negotiated where a student just puts their name in it, what IP you need, and boom, it's already agreed upon. Here's it's like 5% equity, and you're off to the races. And so you're giving up some equity. It's a win for Georgia Tech. I'm like, you're going to make more money at Georgia Tech making your students successful and hopefully do what I did, which was give back in a meaningful way, as opposed to worrying about some royalty structure that takes 2 years to negotiate. But the beauty of that now is it takes about a week to get that IP license at most. And so we've got a lot of startups now that are taking the IP off the shelf at Georgia Tech and putting it into real startups with real impact beyond what the research was in the lab. So that I'm real proud of that, seeing that starting to come together. And then the third piece I would say that's becoming more real is not only did we started with undergrads, but then masters and PhD students were like, how do we do startups? And so they're now involved doing startups. But we're now starting to get faculty to realize that they could do a startup and say, and now there's a push to say, hey, not only publishing in journals counts towards your tenure, but maybe doing a startup should count towards your tenure as well, and getting that recognition. And so that's starting to shift that whole thing. And so post-COVID, Georgia Tech is now starting to reach out to all the faculty going, hey, do you have startup ideas? We'll help you. Before, there was no outbound communication to the researchers and faculty. And so if a faculty member had an idea, they'd go to the IP licensing going, I think I have an idea. Then they were like, what would happen is that office, again, was like, well, tell me your business plan. You got to justify why we need to spend money creating a patent. And so it uphill battle. And most researchers are like, I don't know anything about business plans. Thank God for AI. You could probably crank those out now on any time you need it. But that was a huge blocker. But that's just the wrong model. Georgia Tech switching it to go, look, we want to help startups. We want to have faculty creating startups. And so that's a massive shift. And we've gone from having like 5 faculty startups like 2 years ago. Last year we had about 30. So that's a massive jump compared to what before we were getting like 2 to 3 per year. Now we got 30. I believe there's going to be much more room in that bucket as well. So you got students, you got licensing, you got faculty all kind of coming together. The other big piece in Georgia, just so that kind of a broader thing that's now occurred, is Georgia has a board of regents. I don't know if that's common in most states or not. But in Georgia, all the public universities report into the board of regents. And the chancellor of that, over the summer, I met with him, Sonny Perdue. He used to be the governor. I've met him, and we've worked together on helping bring like computer languages into high school and count as credit. That was one of the things that I was like, why is foreign languages the only way to get that? You have to get a credit on that. And I was like, why? Computer languages are pretty foreign to most people. Why not count that the same? So anyways, he was very pro on that. And so the chancellor this summer was like, hey, what you're doing at Georgia Tech, how do we do this across all the universities? So in Georgia, we've now put together an advisory group, kind of a task force to go take it. And we're starting to see results. So UGA, University of Georgia, they are now launching basically a create accelerator at UGA modeled on Georgia Tech's program, and they basically got funding from a foundation that also was kind of the partnership I had when we set up CreateX. I was like, look, I'm going to make a matching grant. So if you're ever giving money, think about doing it matching, because it forces somebody on the other side to go get other people who believe in what you're building. And that matching has now turned into basically funding not only for Georgia Tech, but like another $3 or $4 million to UGA. And so it's a start with these programs where serious money is being put into different universities, Georgia State, UGA, Kennesaw State. These are all universities with like 20,000 students. If we get 1% of those students to do startups, Georgia's a whole nother place. I mean,
Yeah.
And so that's the vision there. I think we have 500,000 STEM students in Georgia at the university level. I'm like, dude, if we get 1% of those doing startups, game over. We're number one in the
Amazing.
world doing startups.
Yeah. Let's get one of them to create the next Anthropic, and the GDP will go through the roof, right?
And we actually have now quite a few unicorns coming out of Georgia Tech. One that went through CreateX is called Stored.
Yeah.
It's like a warehousing, Airbnb for warehousing, which Sean, I met when he was a freshman. I was like, when he told me where he was going, I was like, here's a check. Let's get going, and he's turned that into a massive business. But I've also had, like you mentioned, international students, and like one of the best outcomes I've had in real money was a woman from Oxford University. She came to Georgia Tech and Emory studying neuroscience. I helped fund her startup. Her company was called Autocruitment, and that turned into a $500 million sale just a couple of years ago.
Outstanding.
And I'm proud to say that she's also a close friend, and but she ended up not taking any VC money. So you can tell what percentage of, like, I got a small slice, but she got the big bulk of that. But ultimately,
Hopefully you avoided the pollution with her too. Great.
yeah, she ended up doing what I think you said your friend was doing, where slow roll the classes. Like she was like, look here, I'm on a student visa. There's a strategy of don't graduate too quick. Take what's the minimal viable class schedule you can take and stay a student. And as long as the university blesses it, you can stay a student for a long time while you work on your startup. And the beauty of that model is also we're having huge success with international students on like the O1 visa, where if you're a founder and you get some press, and we can help you get some press, and you're also you've been funded, et cetera, then getting approved for visa becomes, I think that's going to be an interesting play for international students, especially with this new H-1B policy. So hopefully, if you're wanting to stay in this country, startups are actually a really interesting way. And if you look at how many of my founders are having that are international, it's actually a large number. So, I think they're more risk ready to take on risk.
I always joke and say if I were to start a fund, I would just back immigrants because they're high horsepower, lower ego. Oftentimes, they've gone through a lot of adversity, and as we all know, starting a company, as Elon Musk says, chewing a glass, staring down a dark abyss. And if there's anyone that knows that, you get it too, Chris.
Yeah. So the other thing I'm starting to do that's, I think, unique is Latin America. One of the universities down there reached out to me from Chile and was like, hey, I saw what you're doing at Georgia Tech. Could we partner? So we've partnered with University of Concepcion. We've been funding for about 3 years. And last time I went down there, we had all our founders together. And there's about 30 founders in a room. And they're all building real businesses. And the thing that I brought to the table was, funding, because that was something they didn't have. And they're like, what's the point if you can't get any money? So we're funding them. And in addition to that, because we're so early to it, meaning we're not only the first check, they don't even have a company when we're meeting them, right? And so a lot of them it's a startup idea that's being pitched. The value we can bring is we're saying, look, we'll help you incorporate in the U.S., get you a Delaware C Corp. We'll help you set up a U.S. bank account. We'll help you get a U.S. phone number, address, all that. So you're basically a U.S. company. You just happen to be founders in Chile. And the reason this is key is now you got a U.S. investor. Now you have a U.S. entity because all the IP is here. And I think the other thing that's really key is the global mindset. Because if you go outside the U.S., if you go to Chile, all the pitches were like, hey, we're going to launch in Chile, then go to Argentina, then Brazil, then Colombia, then Mexico, and in about 7 years come to the U.S. market. And I'm like, dude, just, let me double your revenue overnight. Let's target both Latin America, the U.S., Asia, Europe. And we know that there's customers all over for most of these products. So, and that's actually had a big advantage. A lot of these guys are now, and we're doing the same thing out of the Middle East. I had a American University of Beirut and Lebanese American University both reach out, and we've been engaging with them, and we're seeing amazing ideas and talent coming out of that region. And so one of the things that I think over the next 5 to 10 years is we want to scale this globally, meaning, obviously the U.S. will continue to grow what we're doing, not only at Georgia Tech, but other universities here. But, there's millions of students globally. And to your point, backing immigrants or backing international founders everywhere, and then having them unlock that pathway to, come to the U.S., get customers, raise money, whatever they need. We can open those doors much faster than them trying to figure that out on their own.
Absolutely. It's a talent. I always like to say, as an immigrant, single mom, brought my sister and I over kind of the right way legally, became a citizen when I was 17. We want to be the home for the best talent to start businesses, right? And that's like US protecting Einstein. We got a whole new class of entrepreneurs that we want here and that we ought to be sort of rewarding and supporting to ultimately help our country stay competitive. So I hear that in between the lines, and I love that as well, Chris.
Awesome.
And Chris, excuse me, see what happens? Samir did a really good job carrying this episode today, but he really did fail in his job to ask what I thought was one of the most important questions that I'd been waiting to hear from him, which is a hypothetical, of course, since there was so much great advice going around. Let's just say, for example, you have two founders, one well over 51, much better looking and approaching 50, but not there yet, who have a company called, I don't know, the YOUR experience, maybe. What should they do? But maybe we'll save that one for a different podcast episode and keep it focused on Georgia Tech and the accelerator you have there. I'm just really blown away by the success and to hear really the opportunity. We talk about higher education and its value proposition. Boy, doesn't this sound like a great value proposition for students when they get into Georgia Tech, have an opportunity to do something like this. Life-changing, game-changing. And Chris, thank you for doing the great work that you're doing and being able to bring it here to the EdUp experience and tell your story.
Yeah, I'm hoping as your audience listens, is, if you're a student, now's the best time to do a startup. And if there's any way I can help, I'm on LinkedIn, so it's easy to find me. But also, I would, if there's universities out there that want to connect with CreateX and that, I'm also willing to help on that front. Meaning there's a lot of lessons learned there and what worked and what didn't work. One other thing I'll hit on that I see, this is at Georgia Tech, but I assume it's probably not just Georgia Tech alone, but along with the culture of not thinking about doing startups, the other big blocker that a lot of people, why they don't do startups, and this is some advice I'd probably give, is probably why many of the students I run into, the biggest delay is they don't want to fail.
Yeah.
They don't want their startup to fail, which makes them look like a failure, et cetera. And I try to help them realize that, think of startups as doing an experiment And if it doesn't fail, you've learned a lot from that experiment. You didn't fail. That's part of business. And like, I think if you talk to, like, so I already tell all my founders when they get going, I'm backing you, the person, to go figure out a problem that's worth solving. And you'll know when you start talking to customers whether they agree, is this a pain point or not? I think, and here's the data on that. I'd say over 90% of all my startups failed. But it's once they get in that process of talking to customers, refining whatever their idea is, they actually end up pivoting to something that actually starts to click and become like, okay, this is a real business.
It's an iterative process is what you're saying.
That first step of going, I don't want to do the first step because I might fail, is a real cultural issue because it's a lot of people like, I don't want to be labeled that. So I would just try to say, look, make sure you're separating your identity from what you're building, and that you're learning. And I know mental health is a big topic in society, especially at the university level. And I just, I want to make sure people know that, doing a startup, it's more, it's an experiment. You'll learn a lot. If you keep doing the experiment, I have confidence that the vast majority of people will finally figure out what is a problem worth solving. So I would encourage you guys to take that first step. Spend a summer. It's probably going to be every student I've seen that has gone through the summer program and launched a startup, even if they don't go forward with it, they're like, I've learned more in those 3 months because I've now had to think through what is equity, how do you reach customers? How do you build a solution? All these problems that most people have never done in their life. Now you get to do that. And a large number of them actually, almost all of them say, man, I learned so much. And now if I have an idea, I've now got the confidence of taking that first step, even if their first step resulted in an experiment that didn't work out. And the reality is, if you're running a business, guaranteed you have failure. I mean, you're going to make mistakes. And I always felt like, man, if I'm betting on little bit more than half of my mistakes actually, or half of my experiments actually working, I'm probably doing better than my competitors. And so, and I saw that day in, day out with my first company. And I think that's true with all the startups out there, that you're in a constant mode of trying things and seeing what works. And there's no CEO that I've ever met that, will say that, oh, everything just worked. It just doesn't. That's what you get on the maybe in the media, but in reality, every founder has had lots of challenges and late night problems. So it's both a blessing and a challenge. So anyways, I wanted
that advice and
encourage people to try to separate failure from who they are.
Love that. And Chris, you've had great success, and Samir, you have too. So glad to hear you guys talk about the learnings and pass that along to our audience. It's been an honor to listen to the back and forth between you guys and the knowledge that's been shared. Samir Qureshi, of course, our guest co-host, and your guest, everybody, Chris Klaus. He is co-founder of Georgia Tech's Creative Startup Accelerator. Chris, we hope you had a good time here on the podcast talking about what you're doing.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Thanks for having me.
You've just EdUp'd.
Attention.
Let's talk for a second. Higher ed is moving fast, and not everything we're doing is keeping pace. Either you move with the future or you get left behind. Insights EDU is where leaders find out what actually works. February 17th to 19th in Fort Lauderdale. Register at insightsedu.com.
Attention.
It's time to register for Lucian Live, April 19th through 22nd, 2026 in Denver, Colorado, advancing infinite possibilities. And it's higher education without limits. Don't just keep up with change, lead it. Higher ed leaders from around the world are coming together at Lucian Live 2026. Across 4 unforgettable days, you'll discover new ways to meet students where they are and make the most of your technology through inspiring sessions and hands-on demos. Together, we're leveraging AI to create deeper human connections, support every student's journey, and open doors to lifelong learning. See you in Denver. Register now at elive.elucian.com.